Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Ross, and this is a special report from the Law and Crime Network and for our viewers on YouTube Live and Facebook Live. COVID-19 and the law. Your questions with answers about what you can do about your job, your home, your finances, your health, and your rights. Joining me this afternoon is Rachel Stockman of the Law and Crime Network. And Rachel, I was just conducting an interview with the governor of Connecticut who says he thinks the worst is over. About at some point in the next month or so, begin to get back to normal. Meanwhile, the governor of New York has just ordered all New Yorkers to wear face masks wherever they go outside their homes.
Yeah, this is really an extraordinary step taking after what happened in California. Governor Andrew Cuomo saying he would actually require people to wear those face coverings in public settings where they couldn't keep that 6 feet between each other, which, of course, in a crowded city like New York is in many places like subways, public transportation, a very aggressive measure, but one that certainly the governor thinks must be taken right now, given what's going on, and to flatten the curve.
Right, raising lots of questions about what are your rights, what do you have to do, what do you have to follow. And we have two very prominent lawyers joining us today, Rachel. Starting with Dan Horowitz from the firm of McLaughlin Stern, a white-collar defense lawyer, and Heidi Harris from the firm of Aronson, Majewski, and Sloan. Heidi and Dan, thank you both for joining us. Dan, let me start by asking you, there's a lot of talk about, are you ordered now to wear a mask? Must you wear a mask? Is it an impingement on your rights? And in some states, they're checking out-of-state drivers as they cross the border. Are those all legally appropriate?
I think, first of all, good to see you, Brian. Thanks for having me on. I think that there's going to be a new normal here, and there is some flexibility that the government has under, exigent circumstances to impose, restrictions on place, movement, speech. I mean, those are embedded in our Constitution. There's a lot of jurisprudence about that that's been developed over the years. But the government can take reasonable measures to protect the public. And when I say the new normal, with respect to Governor Cuomo's order, as we move hopefully away from the apex and begin to think about re-entering, what might approach, normal for our lives out of our homes, the government's going to have to make some decisions about how can people be outside of their homes safely? How can we have groups of people either congregating, whether it's at their jobs or public transportation, at airports or what have you? And so restrictions like asking people to wear a mask or social distancing with requirements of 6 feet, those are things that are I think most people would consider to be reasonable. The issue is going to be how do those kinds of measures get enforced? Do the police enforce them? What happens if you violate them? I mean, on the one hand, the police force is dealing with its own here in New York City. They're dealing with their own diminished ranks because of the virus. There are health issues involved with enforcement. But, look, it's like anything in life. A lot of what we do is self-enforced and self-policed and based on what we all feel is, appropriate to maintain the structure of our community. So, I would hope that, under these circumstances, most people are going to self-police and understand that if someone's asked to wear a mask when they go outside, there's a good reason for it. So I think that, from a civil rights perspective, asking people to wear a mask outside is not an unreasonable restriction, Brian.
All right. Heidi Harris, you're a matrimonial lawyer, and the family and children and the marriage issues are all being raised because everyone's in their homes, told to stay in place. Lots of issues have come up because of that, including people trying to get married. Here's a report one of our producers put together of people who are finding novel ways to tie the knot.
Coronavirus is ruining wedding plans for so many, but some couples are getting pretty creative to keep their wedding date and still have a ceremony.
We got married in their backyard and then had a little meal there, almost just like the wedding we would have had.
Complete with a socially distant first dance.
A bride in Boardman didn't let social distancing ruin her big day.
Annie and Cole just got married, so this is their honeymoon.
Because we're all locked in the house together, our staycation honeymoon is homeschooling and doing, work on Zoom.
The coronavirus altered their wedding plans, but love still ruled the day.
It was honestly more special than I think, the wedding we had originally planned would have been.
It's very amazing just to still see her walk down the aisle, still allow for the church to have us, get married.
An El Reno couple did not let COVID-19 stop their wedding plans. They actually got married using their phones and an app called Zoom. You've probably heard about that.
Prepared for marriage, we're ready for marriage.
And we planned to get married. We decided that under no circumstances would we postpone.
Love in the time of COVID-19. Heidi Harris, what does this do for people trying to get married? Can they still go ahead and get a ceremony?
Of course they can, and as you saw in the video that we just watched, people are just becoming more creative in doing it. Some people are getting married on a beach just with a justice of the peace or a clergy person. Absolutely, and from my point of view, I think it probably does make for a better story. It makes it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more unique, it's the marriage is the wedding is really just an event. It's the marriage that is more important. And so I think that a lot of these people have recognized that as well.
Heidi, what about matrimonial?
All right, Heidi, a question for you from Rachel Stockman. Yeah.
Yeah, what about matrimonial disputes and divorce, right? So, for instance, what if parents share custody of a child during this time when they're supposed to be in quarantine, not moving around? How are you seeing cases like that resolve themselves? Because I'm sure there's some parents that say don't want their child to go to New York City to visit with their father or vice versa, given what's going on.
We've seen a lot of those cases. My practice is in New York City, and many of our clients also have homes outside of the city. And it has become a daily routine of calls and letters and emails from one party wanting the child or children to stay out of the city, another party doesn't have a place outside the city. And so the question is, how do you balance that? We've had a number of telephone conferences with our judges who have been absolutely fantastic, by the way, in making themselves accessible by telephone for these types of issues. None of them at this point, to my knowledge, have been willing to order access to take place outside of the city. They do encourage people to try and work some plan out. Maybe there is a place where the other parent who doesn't have a residence of their own can stay. Maybe there could be some kind of a nesting arrangement where people share a home inside and out and the child doesn't have to go back and forth. But the judges so far have not been inclined to direct access in New York to take place someplace other than Manhattan. But they are encouraging people to try and work together or through the lawyers to come up with something.
But Heidi, what about the opposite, right? A parent who has a child at home, say in New Jersey, and the other parent lives in New York City. Have you seen judges ordering that child to return to New York City?
Like I said before, they're not ordering. They tend to be ordering that they adhere to the agreement or the order that's already in place. The judges are not going to step in and make that decision as to which location is necessarily safer for the child than the other. It's a parental decision. Judges in general don't like to have to make decisions that parents ordinarily should be able to make themselves. And again, as I mentioned before, they're not prepared, from my experience, to order one place is favorable over another place, unless there is some great reason. If a child has a particular illness or some reason why they should not be traveling back and forth.
If you're just joining us, you're watching a special report from the Law&Crime Network, COVID-19 and the Law, and for our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. And Rachel Stockman, with the stay at home, there have been a big jump in the reports of domestic abuse in this country.
Yeah, this is really one of the very sad things that's happened with so many people confined in their home. Police departments across the country are seeing huge, pretty significant increases in domestic violence. For example, Chicago reporting a 14.6% increase, Boston 22%, Dallas 20%, Los Angeles almost 13%. So these are pretty significant numbers. These are numbers that have been reported in March, and I suspect with April facing the same fate of couples remaining at home with their children, we're going to be facing similar issues.
Some very dramatic issues. I talked earlier with the woman who runs one of the domestic abuse hotlines in New York City, Maureen Curtis.
I think that what we're hearing is people are, survivors are afraid of being in the home, even when there hasn't been physical violence either at all or recently. Just that the tensions are rising, and I mean, anybody living in a home that's confined now, where they can't go out, they're working from home, that's going to add tensions in any relationship. But if there's violence in that relationship, survivors are frightened that that's going to escalate to a point where it'll either become physical if it hasn't been physical, or it'll become more violently physical. We're hearing that survivors are telling us that the people that abuse them are using the COVID virus as a tactic. One woman told us that her husband, who was infected, spit on her, and threatening, using that as a threat, saying that I'm going to infect you as well. Or, they're refusing social distance, if even when they don't know that they have the virus, but they may not be feeling well, and they're staying in very close contact with the survivor.
So what do you tell the people who are calling? They can't really kick somebody out of the house, can they? They have to stay in your house under government order, essentially.
Well, we always safety plan with survivors and speak to them where they are. So if a survivor does not feel safe in their home, we'll talk with them about going into shelter. And because that's still an option. A person can go into shelter by themselves or with their children if they don't feel safe. We'll talk with them about calling the police.
And Maureen, at this point, are police still making arrests on domestic violence cases?
Yes, they are. They're still making arrests. They're still responding in the manner that they normally would. There are still domestic violence units in all police precincts, and the domestic violence police officers are following up. We have a program at Safe Rising where we have advocates working in every single police precinct in New York City, and we work very closely with the domestic violence police officers. Our advocates right now are working remotely, but because of the relationships that we've built in the precincts, we are in daily contact with the officers and getting referrals from these officers so that we're following up with survivors to add additional services to what the police department may have done.
And finally, what's your advice to survivors who are not in cities where there are major domestic violence units like New York City? How do they sort of mitigate? How do they keep things under control in their homes if they're living with somebody involved with domestic violence?
I think the most important thing is for them to know that while a lot of services are now remote, help is still available. Advocates are still available to talk with them about their situation. I mean, we do this all the time, even before the COVID virus, and we continue to do it now, particularly knowing that sometimes this virus can be used as a abusive tactic. But I think the most important thing is to know help is available and advocates are available 24 hours, 7 days a week.
Thank you so much for your time today. Very important advice.
Thank you.
Maureen Curtis of the Safe Horizons Group in New York, running a domestic abuse hotline for anybody who's interested. We'll put the number up on the screen. Heidi Harris, let me ask you, you don't doubt this is the case, right? This is a logical outgrowth of people being kept inside together for long periods of time?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think even in the best of circumstances, everybody's nerves are certainly more frayed. But when you have that type of a dynamic, it certainly lends itself to a much more, explosive type of situation or potential for it. And unfortunately, many survivors of domestic violence don't reach out for help unless they are alone. That's the perfect opportunity for them to start to make the calls to the people they need to talk to. And this sort of certainly prevents that from happening.
Dan Horowitz, I first met you when you represented Bernie Madoff, the great Wall Street Ponzi scammer, with $2 trillion in federal money now being pushed out the door. Certainly there's going to be a huge appetite for fraud here and all kinds of cheating and chicanery.
Absolutely. And you've already seen FBI alerts about COVID fraud that's being perpetrated. See at the bottom of the screen that you've got that notice. So yes, I mean, number one, people need to be vigilant, especially given the economic pressures that people are feeling for scams that offer assistance, loans, any kind of financial assistance. People need to be vigilant about that on the one hand. On the other hand, you've got a tremendous amount of unprecedented amount of federal money that's going out the door to businesses who may be operating with the best of intentions, but who are being asked as part of the CARES Act and the various loan programs that were either in place or Congress just recently put into place. There's a lot of money going out the door, and it's going out for a very specific purpose, and people need to be very careful about what it means to apply for those loans, because you are certifying that you're going to use the money as it's intended for rent or for payroll relief. There's information that you're being asked about your background, and there are very significant consequences that even the innocent who may be acting with the best of intentions could find themselves facing, because there's not just criminal liability under the panoply of federal and state criminal laws for fraud, but there's a very, very powerful civil law that's been around since the Civil War called the False Claims Act. And very simply, it's an act that has been around, as I said, since the Civil War. And if somebody puts in a claim for money from the government, whether they're seeking to be reimbursed for something, or like with the PPP loans, you're asking for the government to obligate themselves to loan you money and you'll pay it back. If there are false statements that are made in those applications and you falsely certify, you could find yourself facing tremendous civil liability to the federal government with treble damages and fines. And the other thing you have to remember, Brian, is at this point, the federal government has a lot of experience because of the TARP Act and the financial crisis in being vigilant about getting money back. So there's fraud risk, and people need to be careful about becoming victims, and the people who are borrowing money need to make sure that they're doing it with the best of intentions.
It's certainly true. It's not free money. Heidi Harris, a question of you from one of our viewers. With the increase in domestic violence, are judges available by phone to ensure protective orders, assuming the victim has somewhere else to stay?
Yes, this would be considered an essential action that a judge would make themselves available for by phone. I would also want to note that the governor has extended all temporary orders of protection until further notice, so that if somebody is concerned that they have an order of protection that is going to expire, they need not be worried about it.
All right. And Dan Horowitz, a question for you from one of our viewers. Do you think Governor Cuomo's executive order should impose a civil or criminal penalty for wearing a face mask to ensure higher compliance?
I think that's a little bit over the top. I mean, first of all, I think that there are already existing laws in place. So, for example, the governor's order is an order. You could be held in contempt. There's probably existing laws on the books for that. So I'm not sure that at this point you need something specific. I think that if you saw significant numbers of people ignoring the orders, then I think that, that there might be some call for some sort of sanction. I think, look, going, Brian, to your original question, the issue of masks is one thing. What happens when the world starts reopening, but we're not fully there yet? And so you're talking about having, people going through some sort of temperature gauge, or other countries have used technology related to smartphones to track people with virus, with the virus, or to see if they've had it and been cured. So I think those kinds of issues become more complicated from a civil liberties perspective. It's one thing for people to wear a mask when they go outside, when everybody knows that, the mask is there to protect people, just themselves as well as others. It's another when you're being asked to give to the government the guts of your technology so the government can track you at any moment. That's a far more, I think, potentially invasive kind of restriction that I think will provoke some serious questions about the reach of the government's right to curtail your civil liberties.
All right, and time for one final question for you, Heidi. A brief answer here. How can we legally get married with the courts being closed? We've got about 30 seconds.
You can get married with a member of the clergy. You can get married. You just need a member of the clergy. You need a witness. You need a license. By the way, the county clerk's office are closed right now, but it doesn't necessarily. I believe that if you have the clergy, you don't need the license at the same time. Find a remote place.
All right, Heidi Harris. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. Those are good answers. And thank you both, Heidi Harris. I want to appreciate you being here, and also Dan Hurwitz. Thanks for taking time out of your day. I know you continue to work even from home as lawyers. And Rachel Stockman, another show coming up on Friday with important issues about the people who are heroes, the food workers. I'm Brian Ross, and this has been a special report from the Law&Crime Network. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay safe.